the story of the world begins in a time of deep shadows and the scent of salt air, where the borders between the living and the spirits have grown thin. In the late 16th century, the land of England is a place of cold stone and iron, where the sovereignty of the secret alchemy has turned the tides of war. The atmosphere here is gray, heavy, and filled with a sense of hidden power. The ground beneath the boots of William, a sailor with a haunted past, is the wet and slick timber of a ship, and the cold cobbles of the Tower of London. The air tastes of sea spray, old damp stone, and the sharp, metallic scent of amrita, the golden spirit stones that hold the power to change the fate of nations. The sound of the world is a low and constant rhythmic thrum of the ocean waves hitting the cliffs, a noise that signals the start of a journey that will take a man from the west to the heart of the rising sun. As William finds himself imprisoned in the dark depths of the tower, the atmosphere shifts to one of sudden and desperate escape. He is not alone in the dark, for he is accompanied by Saoirse, a guardian spirit of the water who has protected him since his youth. This is the era of the man-made monster, where the atmosphere is one of clinking chains and the smell of torch smoke. You see the way the golden light of Saoirse flickers against the damp walls, a beacon of hope in a place designed to break the spirit. This part of the history is a story of the stolen connection, a realization that the powerful men of the world seek to weaponize the spirits for their own gain. The sound of the guards' heavy boots on the stone floor is a sharp and piercing note, a noise that demands the total focus of the survivor. William moves with a sturdy and measured might, his hands finding the cold steel of a discarded sword, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the raw weight of the injustice as he prepares to break his bonds. Deep within the upper reaches of the fortress, the atmosphere becomes cramped, cold, and lethal. William encounters the alchemist Edward Kelly, a man with a voice of dry parchment and eyes that seek only the golden power of the stones. This is the trial of the first betrayal, where the atmosphere is one of swirling dark magic and the hiss of the serpent. The warriors find that Kelly uses the amrita to summon a massive executioner, a beast of muscle and iron that guards the path to the sea. The sound of the executioner's axe hitting the stone is a deep and final boom, making the narrow corridor feel like the inside of a crashing machine. This part of the history is a realization that the war for the spirit stones is not a local conflict, but a global storm. William feels the constant pressure of the fear as Kelly uses his dark arts to snatch Saoirse away, binding the spirit and leaving William alone in the rain. The loss of his guardian spirit marks the beginning of a long and relentless pursuit. Driven by the need to reclaim his connection to the spiritual world, William takes to the sea, following the trail of the alchemist toward the distant islands of Japan. The atmosphere shifts to one of vast, salty, and turbulent motion. This is the story of the sailor's vow, where the atmosphere is one of creaking wood and the smell of the deep sea. You see the way the ship cuts through the dark waves, moving toward a land that is being torn apart by the fires of the Sengoku period. This part of the history is a story of the convergence of two worlds, where the alchemy of the West meets the samurai spirit of the East. The sound of the wind through the rigging is a low and musical note, signaling that the way of the warrior is waiting on the horizon. William moves with a sturdy and balanced power, his eyes fixed on the rising sun, realizing that to find his spirit, he must learn the secrets of a foreign land. The arrival on the shores of Yuzuki is a story of a new and burning reality. William steps onto the sand of Japan, a place where the red of the blood has led to a sovereignty of the living dead. The atmosphere is somber still and filled with the scent of smoke and seaweed. This is a moment of raw and physical change. The warriors find that the villages are not just empty, but haunted by the Yokai, monsters born from the anguish and the Amrita of the war. This part of the history is a story of the foreign samurai, where the tradition of the night meets the reality of the demon slayer. The sound of the waves hitting the rocks is a constant and heavy thrum, making the beach feel like a sacred and dangerous entrance. William moves with a sturdy and measured power, his hand resting on the hilt of a Japanese blade, realizing that the way of the land is a path through the darkness and the iron. Deep in the heart of the village of Yuzuki, the final trial of the first part takes place as William faces the Onryoki, a massive demon born from the hatred of the fallen. The atmosphere is intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the true enemy in this land is the corruption of the soul. This is a story of the sovereignty of the Iron Ball, where the air is filled with the roar of the beast and the clank of chains. The warriors find that the demon is a tragedy made flesh, a mountain of muscle and rage that seeks to crush the intruder. The sound of the chains hitting the wooden floor of the burning ship is a sharp and echoing snap, signaling that the war for Japan is a war for the spirit itself. William moves with a sturdy and measured might, his blade meeting the skin of the demon, realizing that to survive the night, he must become more than just a sailor. The experience in the village ends with William meeting the ninja Hanzo Hattori, a man who speaks of a great change coming to the land. The blue of the night has led to a sovereignty of the golden embers rising from the ruins. He carries the weight of the stolen spirit and the silence of the dead village. The atmosphere is one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man is now a path of the shogun's blade. The focus would now shift to the Isle of Demons and the meeting with the great Lord Ieyasu Tokugawa, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the gold into a world of katana duels, ninja secrets, and the realization that the alchemist was just the beginning. The final legacy of the first part of the journey is a story of the strength in the first step. You have seen the survivor break the walls of the tower and find the darkness of the shore. You have felt the sting of the salt and the weight of the sword. As the silver glow of the moon faded into the shadows of the mountains, and the first cold wind of the land reached the shore, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its first and grounded resolution in the arrival in the East, leaving behind the world of the West for a world of the demon, the samurai, and a journey that was reaching its first and violent plateau. The meeting with the ninja Hanzo Hattori on the storm-lashed shores of Japan marked the beginning of William's transformation from a wandering sailor into a warrior of the rising sun. The atmosphere in the aftermath of the village battle was quiet, damp, and thick with the scent of burnt wood and pine. Hanzo, a man who moved with a silent and calculated grace, represented a world of secrets and shadow that William had never known in the stone halls of Europe. This was the era of the shadow and the steel, where the atmosphere was one of whispered alliances and the sharp gleam of hidden blades. The ground beneath their feet was a mix of wet sand and the dark, rich soil of the Japanese coast, a land that felt ancient and deeply alive. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic thrum of the wind through the cedar trees, a noise that carried the echoes of 1,000 years of war. This part of the history is a story of the Guardian's guidance, a realization that to survive this land of demons, William had to adopt the way of the Nioh. As the journey moved toward the dark and winding caves of Nekatsu, the atmosphere shifted to one of subterranean and seductive danger. These caverns were not merely holes in the earth, but deep and jagged wounds in the mountainside where the shadows seemed to have a weight of their own. The air here was cool, stagnant, and carried the faint, sweet scent of wild flowers and old blood. This was the home of the Hino-enma, a creature of beauty and terror who lured men into the dark with the promise of comfort before draining their lives away. The atmosphere was intimate, dark, and lethally still. The ground beneath the boots was a path of slick limestone and the scattered bones of the lost, a road that led deeper into the belly of the mountain. The sound of the world was a low and constant echo, the sound of water dripping from the ceiling and the fluttering of bat wings in the high crevices. This part of the history is a story of the hidden hunger, a realization that the land's beauty was a mask for its most dangerous predators. Deep within the heart of the caverns, the atmosphere became cramped, chilling, and filled with a paralyzing fear. William found himself standing in a vast stone chamber where the walls were lined with the petrified remains of men who had been turned to stone by the Hino-enma's shriek. This was the trial of the Siren of the Caves, where the atmosphere was one of sudden shrieks and the whir of silk wings. You see the way the creature descended from the ceiling, her body slender and pale against the dark stone, moving with a hectic and brutal speed. This part of the history is a story of the breath of the grave, a realization that the demons of Japan were as much about trickery as they were about power. The sound of her laughter was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that vibrated in the center of the mind, like a struck tuning fork. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the blue glow of the spirit stones embedded in the walls, feeling the steady cold of the underground and the raw weight of the silence. The battle against the Nioh was a story of focus and finality. William had to dodge the paralyzing waves of her voice and the shattering impact of her umbrella, his movements becoming sharp, direct, and unforgiving. The atmosphere was violent, dark, and suffocating with the dust of the cave. This was the trial of the stone and the spirit, where the atmosphere became one of sparking steel and the taste of copper. The warriors found that the creature fought with a starving fury, her wings cutting through the air like serrated razors. The sound of the creature's cry when she was finally struck was a deep and final rattle, making the cavern feel like the inside of a breaking heart. This part of the history is a realization that the darkness of the soul could take the most alluring forms to find its prey. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade finishing the work, realizing that the way of the warrior was the only thing that could cut through the illusion. Leaving the dark of the caves behind, the journey led toward the grand and ancient estate of the Kuroda clan. The atmosphere was vast, somber, and heavy with the presence of authority, a realization that the war for Japan was moving into the halls of power. This part of the history is a story of the feudal debt, where the atmosphere is one of sliding paper doors and the smell of fresh tatami. You see the way the Lord Nagamasa Kuroda looked at William, his eyes filled with a mix of suspense and respect. The air was warm and carried the taste of tea and the heavy scent of incense. The sound of the rain hitting the tiled roof was a low and constant moan, signaling that the storm of the Sengoku was far from over. William stood in the center of the great hall, realizing that his quest for Kelly was now intertwined with the fate of the great lords. The walk through the rain-soaked courtyards was a story of a new allegiance. William moved past the guards and the stone lanterns, his armor clinking in the quiet of the evening. This is a moment of raw and architectural reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the Isle of Demons was just a small piece of a much larger and more complex puzzle. This part of the history is a story of the Gilded Cage, where the tradition of the samurai met the reality of the global conflict. The sound of his wooden sandals on the stone path was a dull and respectful thud, making the survivor feel solid and heavy in a world that was torn between two eras. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand resting on his sword, realizing that the way of the land was now a path through the politics and the blood. Deep in the heart of the estate at night, the final trial of the second part took place as William met the great Lord Ieyasu Tokugawa. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the future of Japan was being decided in the shadows. This is a story of the sovereignty of the unspoken vow, where the air was filled with the weight of the ambition and the scent of the coming war. The conversation was short and focused on the threat of the alchemist and the power of the Amrita. The sound of the wind through the garden was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was already moving to strike at the heart of the shogunate. William stood in the presence of the Lord, his eyes fixed on the horizon, realizing that to reclaim his spirit, he had to become the sword of the new age. The experience in the Kuroda lands ends with William looking toward the high and misty mountains of the interior. The blue of the night had led to a sovereignty of the gray fog rolling off the hills. He carried the weight of the siren's death and the silence of the great lord. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path into the heart of the war. The focus would now shift to the spirit stone slumbers and the assault on the great cathedral. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the gold into a world of monastic secrets, giant statues, and the realization that the alchemist was building an army of the dead. The final legacy of the second part of the journey is a story of the strength in the new knowledge. You have seen the survivor break the silence of the caves and find the ambition of the lords. You have felt the sting of the rain and the weight of the sword. As the silver glow of the moon faded into the shadows of the mountains and the first cold wind of the forest reached the estate, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its second and grounded resolution in the entry into the war, leaving behind the world of the shore for a world of the palace, the politics, and a journey that was reaching its second and tragic plateau. The journey into the sacred lands of Dasefu was a climb from the rain-soaked estates of the coast into a world of ancient stone, rising mist, and the sharp scent of ozone. The air here was no longer filled with the salt of the sea, but was crisp, thin, and carried the heavy smell of wet earth and static. This was a place of high shrines and forgotten temples, where the spiritual energy of the land gathered like a storm waiting to break. The atmosphere was quiet, expectant, and filled with a sacred dread. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of uneven stone steps and slippery moss, a road that had been walked by monks for centuries before the war turned the mountains into a battlefield of souls. The sound of the world was a low and constant hum of the wind moving through the red torii gates, a noise that felt like a warning from the earth itself. This part of the history is a story of the fatting prayer, a realization that even the most holy places were being tainted by the golden hunger of the Amrita. As William reached the upper courtyards of the great shrine, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and electric violence. The sky above the temple darkened to a bruised purple and black, and from the clouds descended the new, a nightmare creature with the face of a monkey, the body of a tiger, and a serpent for a tail. This was the era of the thunder beast, where the atmosphere was one of blinding flashes and the smell of singed fur. You see the way the creature arched its back, calling down bolts of blue lightning that shattered the stone tiles of the roof with the force of a falling mountain. This part of the history is a story of the storm in the sanctuary, a realization that the alchemist Kelly had used the spirit stones to wake the primal terrors of the land. The sound of the thunder was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that vibrated in the chest of the survivor like a heavy drum. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the glow of the beast's throat, feeling the steady heat of the lightning and the raw weight of the danger as he dodged the literal wrath of the heavens. Deep within the ruined foundations beneath the shrine, the atmosphere became cramped, ancient, and filled with the taste of dust. William found himself descending into a labyrinth of forgotten tombs, where the walls were carved with the history of 1,000 years. This was the trial of the silent ancestors, where the atmosphere was one of flickering torchlight and the shadows of giant statues. The warriors found that the ruins were guarded by sentinels of stone, massive figures brought to life by the dark alchemy of the West. The sound of the stone joints grinding together was a deep and grating roar, making the narrow passages feel like the inside of a grinding mill. This part of the history is a realization that Kelly was not just stealing spirits, but digging into the very roots of Japan to find the ultimate source of power. William moved with a sturdy and measured power, his blade meeting the cold surface of the statues, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the dark magic that held the ceiling aloft. The search for the stolen spirit stones led William to a massive underground chamber where the air was luminous with a golden light. The atmosphere was vast, magical, and incredibly heavy, a realization that he had found one of the great veins of the earth. This is a story of the gleaming wealth of the dead, where the atmosphere is one of floating motes of gold and the smell of ancient ozone. You see the way the Amrita crystals grew from the walls like jagged glass flowers, casting long, distorted shadows across the broken coffins of the kings. The air was warm and carried the taste of copper and the heavy scent of spirit. The sound of the energy humming in the air was a low and musical note, signaling that the power to change the world was resting right beneath his hand. William stood in the center of the vault, realizing that the quest for Saoirse was now a battle to prevent the total collapse of the spiritual balance. The walk back toward the surface was a story of a narrow escape. William moved through the crumbling tunnels as the dark energy of the alchemist began to pull the ruins apart. This is a moment of raw and tectonic reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still just before the crash of the falling masonry. This part of the history is a story of the buried truth, where the tradition of the burial met the reality of the scientific theft. The sound of the stone ceiling cracking was a sharp and echoing snap, making the warrior feel solid and heavy in a world that was sinking into the depths. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand gripping his charms, realizing that the way of the soul was the only thing that could guide him through the falling dark. deep in the heart of the mountains at twilight, the final trial of the third part took place as William reunited with Hanzo and the young woman named Jinchio Takebana. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the Takebana clan was the next target in the alchemist's plan. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared blade, where the air was filled with the weight of the responsibility and the scent of the coming snow. The conversation was short and focused on the possessed Lord Munishige and the need to purify the clan's honor. The sound of the mountain wind through the pines was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was already moving to corrupt the nobility of the land. William stood with his new allies, his eyes fixed on the distant castle, realizing that to reclaim his life, he had to become a hero for a people he barely knew. The experience in the Dazefu ruins ends with William looking toward the spiring towers of the Takebana stronghold. The gold of the spirit stones had led to a sovereignty of the deep blue twilight settling over the valley. He carried the weight of the new death and the silence of the ancient kings. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the guardian's duty. The focus would now shift to the withered grass and the crimson sky, and the duel with the lightning samurai. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the shadow into a world of warrior honor, haunted fields, and the realization that Kelly was stealing the faces of the brave. The final legacy of the third part of the journey is a story of the strength in the sacred trial. You have seen the survivor break the power of the storm and find the gold within the earth. You have felt the sting of the lightning and the weight of the stone. As the purple glow of the evening sun faded into the shadows of the peaks, and the first cold air of the heights reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its third and grounded resolution in the descent into the past, leaving behind the world of the shore for a world of the ruins, the spirit, and a journey that was reaching its third and radiant plateau. The journey into the lands of the Takebana clan led William toward a coast where the sea itself seemed to be in a state of violent and spiritual unrest. The air here was no longer the thin mountain mist of Dazefu, but a heavy, choking fog of salt and black bile. This was the site of the great Chugoku region, where the water was filled with the shipwrecks of 1,000 years, and the air carried the bitter scent of wet iron and decay. The atmosphere was dreadful, cold, and suffocatingly gray. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of broken piers and slick sea stone, a road that felt like it was being pulled into the depths by unseen hands. The sound of the world was a low and constant roaring of the waves against the shattered hulls of ghost ships, a noise that signaled the presence of something ancient and massive lurking beneath the surface. This part of the history is a story of the sunken grave, a realization that the war had stirred a darkness in the deep that should have remained asleep. As William stood upon the ruins of a great seaside temple, the atmosphere shifted to one of submerged and colossal danger. From the black water rose the Yumibazu, a massive, oily shadow of a spirit that took the form of a giant, eyeless head made of sea sludge and wreckage. This was the era of the ocean terror, where the atmosphere was one of freezing spray and the smothering weight of the water. You see the way the creature slammed its pillar-like tentacles onto the wooden docks, sending splintered timber flying into the mist. This part of the history is a story of the guardian of the wreckage, a realization that the Amrita had turned the very ocean into a weapon against the living. The sound of the creature's roar was a deep and final boom, a noise that felt like a mountain of water crashing onto the shore. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his feet finding grip on the slippery boards as he used torches of sacred fire to drive back the oily dark, feeling the steady cold of the sea and the raw weight of the pressure as he fought to keep from being dragged into the abyss. Leaving the frozen spray of the coast behind, the journey led toward the golden and storm-swept fields of the Tachibana estate. The atmosphere was vast, electric, and charged with the energy of the coming storm. This was the trial of the lightning samurai, where the atmosphere was one of swirling grass and the smell of ozone. The warriors found that the lord of the house, Munishige Tachibana, had been deceived and replaced by a double created by the alchemist Kelly. This part of the history is a story of the stolen identity, a realization that the enemy was now wearing the faces of Japan's heroes to turn the clans against one another. The sound of the wind through the tall pampas grass was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that carried the hiss of static from the nearby mountains. William moved with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes fixed on the gleaming silver armor of the warrior before him, feeling the steady heat of the lightning that crackled around the blade of the legendary sword, Reikiri. The duel against the false Munishige was a story of speed, honor, and the clash of two worlds. The two warriors moved through the field like streaks of blue and silver light, their blades meeting with a force that sent sparks of holy fire into the darkening sky. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and tense with the weight of the duel. This was the trial of the true warrior, where the atmosphere became one of rhythmic breathing and the sharp ring of steel. The warriors found that the false lord fought with a mechanical and heartless precision, a sign of the alchemist's handiwork. The sound of the swords clashing was a sharp and echoing snap, making the open field feel like the inside of a storm cloud. This part of the history is a realization that true strength came from the bond between a man and his spirit, a connection that Kelly could mimic but never truly possess. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade finally finding the opening in the armor, realizing that the way of the sword was the only way to expose the lie. After the shadow was defeated, the real Munishige was found, and the atmosphere shifted to one of mournful and noble clarity. The real lord, though weakened by the dark magic, stood with a sturdy and measured grace, offering William his thanks and the gift of his spirit. This is a moment of raw and respectful reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the Tachibana clan had been saved. But the shadow of the alchemist was already moving east. This part of the history is a story of the shared burden, where the tradition of the Western samurai met the reality of the Japanese brotherhood. The sound of the rain finally falling on the field was a low and constant moan, making the world feel solid and heavy in the wake of the battle. William stood with the Lord, his hand resting on the hilt of his gift, realizing that the way of the land was now a path through the heart of the great clans. Deep in the heart of the estate at dawn, the final trial of the fourth part took place as William prepared to leave for the Kinai region. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the next step of the journey would lead to the ancient capital of Kyoto. This is a story of the sovereignty of the Eastern Gate, where the air was filled with the weight of the mission and the scent of the coming winter. The conversation with Jinchio Tachibana was short and focused on the protection of the land and the danger of the Amrita. The sound of the morning bell from the nearby temple was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was already building a fortress of chaos in the heart of the country. William stood on the path, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks, realizing that to find the alchemist, he had to enter the center of the world's power. The experience in the Tachibana lands ends with William looking toward the spiring towers of the capital on the horizon. The blue of the morning had led to a sovereignty of the golden sun rising over the fields. He carried the weight of the Yumibazu silence and the honor of the lightning sword. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the shogun's champion. The focus would now shift to the Spider Nest Castle and the haunted halls of Mount Hiei, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the web into a world of trapped spirits, giant spiders, and the realization that Kelly was waking the Demon King. The final legacy of the fourth part of the journey is a story of the strength in the proven heart. You have seen the survivor break the terror of the deep and find the honor within the duel. You have felt the sting of the salt and the weight of the lightning. As the orange glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the valley, and the first warm air of the interior reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its fourth and grounded resolution in the union of the West and East, leaving behind the world of the coast for a world of the capital, the castle, and a journey that was reaching its fourth and golden plateau. The journey into the Kinai region led William toward the Spider Nest Castle of Shijisan, a place where the air was thick with the scent of old silk, dust, and the sour tang of poison. The atmosphere here was no longer the open electric fields of the Tachibana, but was cramped, shadowed, and filled with a creeping dread. This was the domain of Matsunaga Hisahide, a lord known for his love of tea and his dark, treacherous ambition. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of rotting floorboards and sticky white webs, a road that felt like it was watching the intruder from every crack in the wall. The sound of the world was a low and constant scuttling, the sound of 1,000 tiny legs moving behind the sliding paper doors, a noise that signaled that the natural order had been replaced by a hived mind of hunger. This part of the history is a story of the trapped spirit, a realization that the alchemist Kelly had used the golden power of the stones to turn a noble house into a nightmare of silk and fang. As William climbed the winding paths toward the main keep, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and multi-legged horror. From the shadows emerged the Jorogumo, a massive creature that was half woman and half spider, her body covered in golden armor and shimmering webs. This was the era of the Silk Queen, where the atmosphere was one of sticky entrapment and the hiss of poison. You see the way the creature moved with a twitched and rhythmic grace, spinning nets of liquid steel that could bind a man in an instant. This part of the history is a story of the web of deceit, a realization that the beauty of the lady of the castle had been consumed by the spite and the Amrita. The sound of her chitinous legs hitting the wood was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the courtyard like rattling knives. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his blade cutting through the thick webs, feeling the steady heat of the burning torches and the raw weight of the claustrophobia. As he fought to reach the center of the nest, leaving the silk-choked ruins of Shijisan behind, the journey led toward the sacred and mist-covered peak of Mount Hiei. The atmosphere was vast, ancient, and heavy, with the presence of old gods, a realization that the spiritual heart of Japan was under direct assault. This was the trial of the desecrated seal, where the atmosphere was one of blue spirit light and the smell of burning incense. The warriors found that Kelly had shattered the ancient wards that kept the spirits in balance, allowing the Yokai of the mountain to roam free. This part of the history is a story of the broken peace, a realization that the alchemist sought to drown the capital in chaos, to find the ultimate source of the spirit stones. The sound of the mountain wind through the temple bells was a deep and final boom, a noise that carried the grief of the land across the valley. William moved with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes fixed on the glowing cracks in the earth, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the malice that was rising from the soil. Deep within the heart of the mountain temples, the atmosphere became cramped, holy, and violently disturbed. William found the white tiger, a massive, winged beast born from the soul of a fallen monk, and the purity of the mountain. This was the trial of the shattered purity, where the atmosphere was one of roaring white light and the spray of holy fur. The warriors found that the creature was not a monster by choice, but a being of spirit that had been driven mad by the corruption of the Amrita. The sound of the tiger's roar was a sharp and echoing snap, making the temple courtyard feel like the inside of a cracking diamond. This part of the history is a realization that even the brightest spirits could be turned into weapons of destruction by the greed of men. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade meeting the ethereal flesh of the guardian, realizing that the only way to save the spirit was to release it from its tainted physical form. The search for the true culprit led William to confrontation with the alchemist's shadow in the depths of the Imperial Library. The atmosphere was quiet, dusty, and filled with the smell of old ink and magic. This is a story of the knowledge as a weapon, where the atmosphere is one of floating scrolls and the hiss of the serpent. You see the way the golden motes of spirit danced in the air, illuminating the secret maps of the ley lines. The air was warm and carried the taste of old parchment and the heavy scent of alchemy. The sound of Kelly's mocking laughter was a low and musical note, signaling that the destruction of the seals was only the first act of a larger tragedy. William stood in the center of the knowledge, realizing that the quest for Saoirse was now a race to save the throne itself. The walk through the ancient streets of Kyoto at night was a story of a city in waiting. William moved past the closed gates and the silent shrines, his armor a dark and constant shadow in the moonlight. This is a moment of raw and historical reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the capital of the world was resting on a foundation of thin glass. This part of the history is a story of the calm before the storm, where the tradition of the court met the reality of the demonic incursion. The sound of his boots on the bridge was a dull and respectful thud, making the survivor feel solid and heavy in a world that was losing its grip on the light. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand resting on his katana, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the heart of the empire. Deep in the heart of the imperial palace, at dawn, the final trial of the fifth part took place as William met the Lady Akatsu, a female ninja with a heart of ice and a blade of silver. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that even within the house of the shogun, there were those who distrusted the golden power. This is a story of the sovereignty of the secret duty, where the air was filled with the weight of the family honor and the scent of the coming winter. The conversation was short and focused on the hatred of the samurai and the danger of the Amrita. The sound of the morning mist moving through the palace gardens was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was already coiling around the throat of the shogunate. William stood with his new ally, his eyes fixed on the horizon, realizing that to defeat the alchemist, he had to become the last shield of the emperor. The experience in the Kinai region ends with William looking toward the high and smoking peaks of the Iga province. The blue of the morning had led to a sovereignty of the gray smoke rising from the ninja villages. He carried the weight of the tiger's silence and the honor of the library. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path into the land of the ninja. the focus would now shift to the Iga mansion and the giant toad, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the shadow into a world of illusionary walls, poisonous fogs, and the realization that the past was a living ghost. The final legacy of the fifth part of the journey is a story of the strength in the broken seal. You have seen the survivor break the web of the queen and find the sorrow within the tiger. You have felt the sting of the poison and the weight of the mountain. As the orange glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the palace, and the first cold air of the winter reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its fifth and grounded resolution in the defense of the capital, leaving behind the world of the castle for a world of the shadow, the spirit, and a journey that was reaching its fifth and silver plateau. The journey into the shadows of the Iga province led William into a world of whistling bamboo, hidden mechanisms, and the sharp scent of gunpowder and pine. The air here was no longer the heavy incense of the capital, but was cold, thin, and carried the metallic tang of hidden steel. This was the secret heart of the ninja clans, a land where every tree and stone served a purpose in the art of the shadow. The atmosphere was intimate, tense, and filled with a quiet lethality. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of damp earth and fallen leaves, a road that felt like a trigger for 1,000 hidden traps. The sound of the world was a low and constant rustle, the sound of the wind moving through the mountain passes, and the rhythmic, distant click of wooden gears shifting deep within the earth. This part of the history is a story of the master of the shadow, a realization that in the land of the ninja, the invisible thread was more dangerous than the open blade. As William entered the Iga mansion, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and illusionary confusion. The house was not a home, but a living puzzle, a place where the walls rotated, the ceilings dropped, and the floors were filled with hidden spikes and secret passages. This was the era of the Trickster's Keep, where the atmosphere was one of flickering candles and the smell of old oil. You see the way the rooms flipped upside down with the kick of a lever, turning the familiar into the disorienting and deadly. This part of the history is a story of the ghostly architect, a realization that the ninja had built their world to be a meat grinder for the unprepared. The sound of a sliding door moving behind him was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that signaled a change in the very shape of the reality. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the faint scuff marks on the wood, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the raw weight of the paranoia that filled every hallway. Deep within the heart of the mansion's inner courtyard, the atmosphere became vast, hazy, and filled with a thick cloud of smoke. William found himself standing before the giant toad, a massive, bipedal creature with golden eyes and a long, iron pipe. This was the trial of the father's spirit, where the atmosphere was one of swirling fog and the hiss of poisonous embers. The warriors found that the toad was not a beast of the wild, but the spirit of Hanzo's father, a legendary master who had taken this form to guard the secrets of the clan. The sound of the toad's spear hitting the stone was a deep and final boom, making the courtyard feel like the inside of a thundercloud. This part of the history is a realization that the lineage of the ninja was a burden of duty and transformation. William had to dodge the explosive bombs and the lashing tongue, feeling the steady heat of the tobacco smoke and the constant pressure of the reach, a feeling of total and grounded focus as he fought to prove his worth to the old master. The battle against the giant toad was a story of legacy and respect. William had to match the brutal speed of the spear with his own measured and precise counterstrikes, his movements becoming fluid, adaptive, and resolute. The atmosphere was violent, hazy, and tense with the weight of the tradition. This was the trial of the inherited blade, where the atmosphere became one of sparking steel and the taste of smoke. The warriors found that the spirit fought with a playful but lethal wisdom, testing the resolve of the Western samurai. The sound of the spear clashing against the katana was a sharp and echoing snap, making the open courtyard feel like the inside of a sacred dojo. This part of the history is a realization that true mastery was about the balance between the light and the shadow. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade finally finding the opening in the guard, realizing that the way of the ninja was a path of sacrifice for the greater peace. After the spirit was pacified, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet and respectful understanding. The giant toad reverted to a calm and watching presence, offering William the wisdom of the old ways and the direction to the next goal. This is a moment of raw and spiritual reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the ninja of Iga were now the last shield of the West. This part of the history is a story of the passing of the torch, where the tradition of the father met the reality of the son's burden. The sound of the wind through the bamboo was a low and constant moan, making the world feel solid and heavy in the wake of the duel. William stood with Hanzo, who looked upon the spirit of his father with a mix of grief and pride, realizing that the way of the land was now a path through the memory and the ghost. Leaving the mountains of Iga behind, the journey led toward the dark and snow-covered ruins of the Fudamata castle. The atmosphere was vast, cold, and heavy, with the scent of ice and old blood, a realization that the war for the soul of Japan was moving into the heart of the winter. This part of the history is a story of the frozen regret, where the atmosphere is one of falling flakes and the smell of wet iron. You see the way the snow covered the bodies of the fallen, turning the battlefield into a white and silent tomb. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of the grave. The sound of the crows crying from the high walls was a sharp and piercing note, signaling that the shadow of the alchemist was already calling the dead to rise. William moved through the white mist, his eyes fixed on the glowing eyes in the dark, realizing that the only way to the end was to face the ghost of the fallen queen. Deep in the heart of the snow-choked courtyard, the final trial of the sixth part took place as William met the Yukiana, the snow woman who was once the wife of the Demon King. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the alchemist Kelly had used the Amrita to bring the most tragic figures of history back to a hateful and frozen life. This is a story of the sovereignty of the blue ice, where the air was filled with the hiss of frost and the whistle of ice spears. The warriors found that the queen fought with a graceful and heartbreaking fury, her very breath turning the air to glass. The sound of the ice shattering against the shield was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was the desecration of the resting place. William stood in the blizzard, his blade glowing with the heat of his will, realizing that to save the land, he had to put the dead back to sleep. The experience in the Iga and Futamata lands ends with William looking toward the massive and glowing peaks of the Takai region. The white of the snow had led to a sovereignty of the black smoke rising from the volcanic mountains. He carried the weight of the toad's wisdom and the silence of the Snow Queen. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the Kingbreaker. The focus would now shift to the defiled castle and the immortal flame, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the ash into a world of burning fortresses, giant skeletons, and the realization that Kelly was resurrecting the Demon King himself. The final legacy of the sixth part of the journey is a story of the strength in the shadow's wisdom. You have seen the survivor break the illusion of the mansion and find the sorrow within the snow. You have felt the sting of the frost and the weight of the spear. As the blue glow of the winter moon faded into the shadows of the peaks, and the first cold air of the volcano reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its sixth and grounded resolution in the purification of the past, leaving behind the world of the ninja for a world of the fire, the demon, and a journey that was reaching its sixth and iron plateau. The journey into the Takai region led William toward the Sekigahara battlefield, a place where the air was no longer filled with the crisp scent of snow, but was heavy, choking, and smelling of sulfur, old blood, and burnt iron. This was the site of the greatest conflict in the history of the land, where the fate of the shogunate would be decided. But the golden power of the Amrita had turned the field into a living purgatory. The atmosphere here was vast, violent, and filled with the screams of ghosts. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of mud, broken spears, and shattered banners, a road that felt like it was sinking into the depths of a dark sun. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic thrum of drums, and the distant, metallic clashing of armies that were no longer human. This part of the history is a story of the great slaughter, a realization that the alchemist Kelly had used the agony of the fallen to feed a monster could swallow the world. As William stood upon the edge of the blood-soaked valley, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and colossal horror. From the earth rose the Bushido, a massive, towering skeleton made from the bones of thousands of soldiers who had died with hatred in their hearts. This was the era of the bone giant, where the atmosphere was one of crushing weight and the glow of malice. You see the way the creature's ribs formed a cage of black iron as it swept its hands across the field, crushing entire battalions into the dirt. This part of the history is a story of the collective rage, a realization that the war had created a debt of pain that the living could not pay. The sound of the skeleton's jaw clicking open was a deep and final boom, a noise that felt like a mountain of granite splitting apart. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his feet finding grip on the high ledges as he used sacred stones to weaken the giant's spirit. Feeling the steady heat of the underworld and the raw weight of the death that surrounded him, leaving the nightmare of the battlefield behind, the journey led toward the defiled castle of Edo, the seat of the shogunate that had been corrupted from within. The atmosphere was cramped, poisonous, and heavy with the presence of malignant magic. This was the trial of the Twisted Palace, where the atmosphere was one of purple mists and the hiss of leaking pipes. The warriors found that Kelly had turned the very foundations of the castle into a vat of alchemical filth, where the guards had become hollowed shells serving the dark. This part of the history is a story of the internal rot, a realization that the enemy was no longer at the gates, but coiled around the heart of the government. The sound of the bubbling sludge in the corridors was a low and constant moan, making the grand hallways feel like the inside of a sick animal. William moved with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes fixed on the glowing seals on the doors, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the corruption that sought to drown him in the dark. Deep within the heart of the castle's secret laboratory, the atmosphere became cold, industrial, and filled with the smell of ancient chemicals. William found himself standing before Lady Kasuga, who had been transformed by the alchemist into a creature of golden light and sharp claws. This was the trial of the sacred betrayal, where the atmosphere was one of swirling magic and the spray of embers. The warriors found that Kelly was harvesting the very souls of the noble families to power his experiments. The sound of the magic circles forming on the floor was a sharp and piercing note, making the laboratory feel like the inside of a burning clock. This part of the history is a realization that the scientific greed of the West had found a perfect home in the tragedies of the East. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade meeting the ethereal shield of the lady, realizing that the only way to stop the rot was to break the man who had planted the seeds. The search for Kelly led William to a confrontation in the main audience chamber, where the air was luminous with the light of the spirit stones. The atmosphere was vast, tense, and incredibly heavy, a realization that the future of the shogunate was hanging by a single thread. This is a story of the empty throne, where the atmosphere is one of floating dust and the hiss of the serpent. See the way the golden motes of Amrita danced in the moonlight, illuminating the stolen faces that Kelly had kept in his collection. The air was warm and carried the taste of copper and the heavy scent of old blood. The sound of the alchemist's mocking voice was a low and musical note, signaling that the resurrection of the Demon King was the final goal of the long game. William stood in the center of the power, realizing that the quest for Saoirse was now a battle to prevent the birth of a god. The walk back through the burning gardens of Edo was a story of a city in flames. William moved past the collapsing towers and the silent statues, his armor charred and heavy from the heat of the fire. This is a moment of raw and tectonic reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still just before the roar of the collapsing roof. This part of the history is a story of the sacrificed peace, where the tradition of the castle met the reality of the alchemical war. The sound of the wood cracking in the heat was a sharp and echoing snap, making the warrior feel solid and heavy in a world that was turning to ash. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand gripping his charms, realizing that the way of the soul was the only thing that could lead him through the final storm. Deep in the heart of the underground vaults at dawn, the final trial of the seventh part took place as William prepared to leave for the Omi province. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the demon King Nobunaga Oda was being summoned back to the world of the living. This is a story of the sovereignty of the forbidden ritual, where the air was filled with the weight of the impossible and the scent of the coming end. The conversation with the Lord Ieyasu was short and focused on the final stand of the shogunate and the power of the true king. The sound of the morning wind through the ruins of the castle was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was already opening the gates of the underworld. William stood on the path, his eyes fixed on the Mount Azuchi on the horizon, realizing that to finish the journey, he had to kill the king who would not stay dead. The experience in the Tokai region ends with William looking toward the spiring towers of the Demon King's fortress. The red of the fire had led to a sovereignty of the purple darkness settling over the mountains. He carried the weight of the giant's silence and the honor of the defiled house. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the Kingslayer. The focus would now shift to the Demon King's return and the assault on Mount Azuchi. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the Black Sun into a world of immortal warriors, dark miracles, and the realization that the end of the war was the end of the world. The final legacy of the seventh part of the journey is a story of the strength in the crushed bone. You have seen the survivor break the will of the giant and find the sorrow within the palace. You have felt the sting of the poison and the weight of the flame. as the purple glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the peaks, and the first cold air of the summit reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its seventh and grounded resolution in the purification of the capital, leaving behind the world of the castle for a world of the mountain, the king, and a journey that was reaching its seventh and final plateau. The journey to the cursed Mount Azuchi was a climb into the heart of a golden and terrifying nightmare. The air here was no longer the smell of the battlefield, but was thick with the scent of incense, ozone, and the cold power of the Amrita. This was the fortress of Oda Nobunaga, the Demon King, a place that had been pulled back from the brink of destruction by Kelly's dark alchemy. The atmosphere was quiet, majestic, and filled with a sense of ancient authority. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of polished black stone and shimmering gold leaf, a road that felt like it was floating above the clouds of the mortal world. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic thrum of the mountain wind moving through the high rafters, a noise that sounded like the breathing of a sleeping god. This part of the history is a story of the resurrected shadow, a realization that the past was being violently reborn to crush the future of Japan. As William ascended the spiral paths of the mountain, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and legendary combat. He was not facing common soldiers, but the ghosts of the great generals, warriors who had died decades ago, but were now bound to the golden stones. This was the era of the hero's return, where the atmosphere was one of blinding spirit light and the sharp ring of famous blades. You see the way the warriors moved with a measured and precise might, their eyes glowing with a quiet and purposeful flame. This part of the history is a story of the King's Guard, a realization that the Demon King's charisma was so strong it could pull the dead back into service. The sound of the katana's meeting was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the cliffs like a bell tolling for the end of an era. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade meeting the steel of the legends, feeling the steady heat of the combat and the raw weight of the history that he was fighting to put back in the grave. Deep within the heart of the main keep, the atmosphere became vast, silent, and incredibly tense. William found himself standing in a grand audience chamber where the walls were made of solid gold and painted with the dreams of conquest. Sitting upon the throne was Oda Nobunaga, the Demon King himself, his presence filling the room with a cold and suffocating majesty. This was the trial of the true sovereign, where the atmosphere was one of held breaths and the smell of burning silk. The warriors found that Nobunaga did not fight with rage, but with a calm and absolute superiority, his sword moving like a flash of purple lightning. The sound of the king's voice was a deep and final boom, making the grand hall feel like the inside of a waiting storm. This part of the history is a realization that the king was not a puppet of the alchemist, but a will of his own that refused to be used for the petty goals of the West. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the rhythmic flow of the king's blade, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the divine power. The duel against the Demon King was a story of respect and departure. Nobunaga fought to test the resolve of the Westerner, his movements becoming fluid, graceful, and untouchable. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and filled with the taste of copper. This was the trial of the heavenly will, where the atmosphere became one of sparking miracles and the whistle of the wind. The warriors found that the king was unbound by the rules of the living, his very presence warping the light around him. The sound of the swords clashing was a sharp and echoing snap, making the open chamber feel like the center of the universe. This part of the history is a realization that true power was the ability to choose when to leave the stage. As the battle reached its peak, Nobunaga simply stopped, his eyes filled with a quiet and ancient wisdom, realizing that the age of man was no longer his to lead. William stood with his blade lowered, realizing that the way of the king was a path of dignity in the face of the infinite. With the king's departure, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and desperate hatred. The alchemist Kelly, realizing his plan had failed, retreated into the hidden laboratory beneath the throne. This is a moment of raw and alchemical reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still just before the hiss of the serpent. This part of the history is a story of the cornered rat, where the tradition of the samurai met the reality of the Western science. The sound of the bubbling Amrita vats was a sharp and piercing note, making the underground room feel like the inside of a boiling lung. William moved through the golden fog, his eyes fixed on the stolen spirit of Saoirse, feeling the steady heat of his anger and the raw weight of the final chase. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand gripping his sword, realizing that the way of the soul was now a path through the glass and the blood. Deep in the heart of the alchemical pit, the final trial of the 8th part took place as William faced the Yamato no Orochi, a massive, 8-headed serpent summoned by the last of Kelly's power. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the ancient curse of Japan had been woken for one final strike. This is a story of the sovereignty of the great serpent, where the air was filled with the roar of the 8 mouths and the spray of elemental fire, ice, and lightning. The warriors found that the beast was a living mountain of hatred, its scales harder than any steel. The sound of the serpent's shriek was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was the endless cycle of malice. William stood on the edge of the pit, his blade glowing with the light of his journey, realizing that to reclaim his spirit, he had to kill the myth of the dark. The experience at Mount Azuchi ends with the fall of the serpent and the death of the alchemist Kelly. The gold of the fortress had led to a sovereignty of the cold ashes falling from the sky. He carried the weight of the king's respect and the silence of the reclaimed spirit. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path back to the shore. The focus would now shift to the Demon King's castle, and the return to the west. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the sea into a world of ghostly memories, falling crowns, and the realization that the war for the world was just beginning. The final legacy of the 8th part of the journey is a story of the strength in the final rest. You have seen the survivor break the will of the alchemist and find the peace within the king. You have felt the sting of the lightning and the weight of the gold. As the purple glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the peaks, and the first warm air of the victory reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its 8th and grounded resolution in the victory at Azuchi, leaving behind the world of the mountain for a world of the sea, the spirit, and a journey that was reaching its 8th and eternal plateau. The return to the shores of England was a journey into a world of gray stone, chilling fog, and the familiar weight of the past. The air here was no longer filled with the sharp ozone of the Japanese mountains, but was heavy, damp, and carried the scent of coal smoke and ancient iron. This was London, the heart of an empire that had secretly fueled its rise with the golden power of the Amrita stolen from the east. The atmosphere was oppressive, gloomy, and filled with a sense of imminent decay. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was the slick, wet cobblestones of the Tower of London, a place where William had once been a prisoner and was now returning as a master of the sword. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic thrum of the city's heart, a noise that sounded like the grinding of great iron gears beneath the earth. This part of the history is a story of the circle closing, a realization that the true source of the world's suffering was not a demon in Japan, but a man in a high tower of stone. As William broke through the gates of the tower once more, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and industrial violence. He was not facing simple guards, but the alchemical knights, soldiers who had been fused with the spirit stones to become towers of muscle and gold. This was the era of the Iron Golem, where the atmosphere was one of clanging metal and the hiss of pressurized steam. You see the way the knights moved with a sturdy and measured might, their armor glowing with a quiet and purposeful flame. This part of the history is a story of the Empire's secret, a realization that the golden stones had been used to build a war machine that threatened the balance of the entire world. The sound of the heavy maces hitting the stone was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the prison cells like a hammer on a cold anvil. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his Japanese blades cutting through the European plate, feeling the steady cold of the rain and the raw weight of the betrayal that had started his journey. Deep within the heart of the tower's secret laboratories, the atmosphere became cramped, dark, and filled with the smell of ancient chemicals. William found himself standing in a grand observatory where the walls were lined with glass vats of golden fluid and maps of the world's ley lines. Standing before the telescope was John Dee, the Queen's alchemist, a man whose voice was a dry and scholarly whisper that hid a bottomless ambition. This was the trial of the true architect, where the atmosphere was one of flickering torchlight and the hiss of the serpent. The warriors found that Di sought to drown the world in eternal war, to ensure a constant supply of the Amrita born from human suffering. The sound of the alchemist's pen scratching on parchment was a deep and final boom, making the laboratory feel like the inside of a waiting mouth. This part of the history is a realization that the scientific greed of the West was the mirror image of the demons he had fought in the East. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the rhythmic glow of the magic circles, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the dark magic. The battle against the alchemist's final creation was a story of magic and reality. John Dee transformed into the 100 Eyes, a massive, floating nightmare of flesh and spirit stones that filled the room with beams of pure golden energy. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and filled with the taste of ozone. This was the trial of the gaze of the infinite, where the atmosphere became one of whistling beams and the spray of glass. The warriors found that the monster was a manifestation of the alchemist's greed, its many eyes tracking every movement of the ash. The sound of the energy beams hitting the floor was a sharp and echoing snap, making the observatory feel like the inside of a shattering mirror. This part of the history is a realization that true knowledge was meant to protect the world, not consume it. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade finally finding the central core of the eye, realizing that the way of the soul was the only way to close the eye of the abyss. With the defeat of John Dee, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet and final resolution. The alchemist fell into the darkness of his own creation, leaving behind a world that was finally free of his influence. This is a moment of raw and existential reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still as the golden light of the Amrita began to fade from the tower. This part of the history is a story of the silence of the crown, where the tradition of the night met the reality of the global savior. The sound of the rain hitting the Thames was a low and constant moan, making the world feel solid and heavy in the wake of the battle. William stood at the window of the tower, his spirit Saoirse by his side, realizing that the way of the land was now a path through the peace and the quiet. Leaving the cold stone of London behind, the journey led back toward the misty and distant shores of Japan. The atmosphere was vast, salty, and filled with a sense of coming home, a realization that his heart had remained in the land of the samurai. This part of the history is a story of the final return, where the atmosphere is one of creaking wood and the smell of the deep sea. You see the way the ship cut through the waves, moving toward a land that was preparing for its final great conflict. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of the pine. The sound of the wind through the sails was a sharp and piercing note, signaling that that the shadow of the war was once again coiling around the throat of the shogunate. William stood on the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon, realizing that his true duty was to protect the peace he had helped build. Deep in the heart of the imperial capital, once more, the final trial of the ninth part took place as William reunited with Hanzo Hattori. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the siege of Osaka was about to begin. This is a story of the sovereignty of the final stand, where the air was filled with the weight of the history and the scent of the coming snow. The conversation was short and focused on the resurrection of the Toyotomi clan and the danger of the red armor. The sound of the morning bell from the nearby temple was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was now the human ambition that refused to die. William stood with his old friend, his eyes fixed on the distant castle, realizing that to save the land, he had to face the ghost of the great unifier. The experience in London ends with William looking toward the spiring towers of Osaka Castle. The gray of the Thames had led to a sovereignty of the deep crimson sky settling over the mountains. He carried the weight of the Dee's silence and the honor of the reclaimed kingdom. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path of the shogun's final shield. The focus would now shift to the dragon of the north and the siege of the Crimson Castle, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the winter into a world of massive armies, legendary generals, and the realization that the war for Japan was reaching its final and bloodiest hour. The final legacy of the ninth part of the journey is a story of the strength in the completed circle. You have seen the survivor break the will of the alchemist and find the peace within the West. You have felt the sting of the rain and the weight of the eye. As the silver glow of the morning moon faded into the shadows of the peaks, and the first cold air of the winter reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its ninth and grounded resolution in the victory over the master, leaving behind the world of the West for a world of the East, the war, and a journey that was reaching its ninth and final plateau. The journey into the freezing northern reaches of Mutsu led William into a world of whirling snow, jagged blue ice, and the sharp scent of pine and frozen iron. The air here was no longer the damp coal smoke of London, but was crisp, lethal, and carried the heavy smell of deep winter and rising Amrita. This was the domain of the one-eyed dragon Masamune Date, a lord of vast ambition and unyielding pride, who had turned his eyes toward the golden power of the spirit stones to secure his family's future. The atmosphere was quiet, chilling, and filled with a sense of ancient nobility. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of deep, white snow and frozen earth, a road that felt like it was hardening into glass with every passing hour. The sound of the world was a low and constant whistle, the sound of the wind moving through the mountain passes, and the rhythmic, distant clatter of armored cavalry moving through the mist. This part of the history is a story of the dragon's ambition, a realization that even after the alchemist's death, the golden hunger remained a poison in the hearts of the living. As William climbed the winding paths toward the Yaba castle, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and predatory lethality. He was not facing simple soldiers, but the dragon's guard, warriors who fought with a brutal and cold efficiency that mirrored the climate of their home. This was the era of the blue steel, where the atmosphere was one of flickering torchlight and the smell of wet fur. You see the way the warriors moved through the snow, their movements fluid and direct, their blades glowing with the faint blue light of the northern spirits. This part of the history is a story of the unbroken will, a realization that Masamune Date had built a fortress of ice that could withstand the fires of any war. The sound of the katanas hitting the shields was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the cliffs like a crack of a winter branch. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the rhythmic flow of the steel, feeling the steady cold of the blizzard and the raw weight of the duty that led him toward the high keep. Deep within the heart of the main hall, the atmosphere became vast, majestic, and incredibly tense. William found himself standing before Masamune Date, who sat upon his seat with one eye fixed on the future and the other lost to the history of his clan. This was the trial of the one-eyed dragon, where the atmosphere was one of swirling blue magic and the smell of cold incense. The warriors found that Masamune did not fight with the desperation of the alchemist, but with the absolute authority of a king, his twin blades moving in a whirlwind of blue and silver light. The sound of the dragon's blades hitting the floor was a deep and final boom, making the grand hall feel like the inside of a cracking glacier. This part of the history is a realization that true ambition was a force of nature that could not be easily put to rest. William moved with a sturdy and measured power, his eyes tracking the rhythmic dance of the twin blades, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the northern spirits. The battle against Masamune Date was a story of respect and mutual resolve. William had to match the blinding speed of the blue dragon with his own hardened and grounded defense, his movements becoming sharp, minimal, and unforgiving. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and filled with the taste of salt. This was the trial of the Northern Star, where the atmosphere became one of sparking steel and the whistle of the wind. The warriors found that the Dragon Lord was guided by the spirit of the blue dragon, his attacks carrying the weight of the mountain. The sound of the swords clashing was a sharp and echoing snap, making the open courtyard feel like the center of a great storm. This part of the history is a realization that true leadership was about the protection of the people, a lesson that Masamune finally accepted as he lowered his blades. William stood in the clearing snow, his heart steady and calm. realizing that the way of the warrior was a path of understanding, even in the middle of the fight. Leaving the frozen peace of the north behind, the journey led toward the massive and war-torn walls of Osaka Castle. The atmosphere was vast, violent, and heavy, with the scent of gunpowder and burning wood, a realization that the final conflict of the era had finally begun. This part of the history is a story of the Great Siege, where the atmosphere is one of soaring fireballs and the smell of thousands of men. You see the way the Sanada crimson armor glowed in the light of the setting sun, a sign of the last defiance against the Tokugawa peace. The air was hot and carried the taste of smoke and the heavy scent of the earth. The sound of the cannons firing from the high ramparts was a sharp and piercing note, signaling that the shadow of the war was now an open flame that would consume the land. William moved through the trenches and the ruined camps, his eyes fixed on the golden spires of the castle, realizing that to end the conflict, he had to face the brave and the dead. Deep in the heart of the Sanada Maru fortification, the final trial of the 10th part took place as William faced the legendary Yukimura Sanada, a warrior known as the greatest soldier in Japan. The atmosphere was intimate, hot, and resolute, a realization that this was a duel of pure spirit. This is a story of the sovereignty of the Crimson Spear, where the air was filled with the roar of the fire and the hiss of the steam. The warriors found that Yukimura moved with a steady and measured might, his spear carrying the will of the fallen Toyotomi clan. The sound of the spear thrusts was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was the tragedy of a war that had no place left to go. William stood in the center of the burning fort, his blade meeting the crimson steel, realizing that, to save the future, he had to respect the courage of the past. The experience at Osaka ends with William looking toward the inner sanctum of the castle. As the first snow of the new winter began to fall over the flames, the red of the armor had led to a sovereignty of the gray smoke settling over the plains. He carried the weight of the dragon's vow and the silence of the Sanada fort. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path into the heart of the final shadow. The focus would now shift to the bloodshed's end and the descent into the abyss, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the mother into a world of ancient fox spirits, burning palaces, and the realization that the end of the war was the birth of a new Japan. The final legacy of the 10th part of the journey is a story of the strength in the frozen resolve. You have seen the survivor break the will of the dragon and find the honor within the siege. You have felt the sting of the ice and the weight of the cannon. As the orange glow of the burning castle faded into the shadows of the night, and the first cold air of the winter reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its 10th and grounded resolution in the entry into the Great War, leaving behind the world of the North for a world of the siege, the soldier, and a journey that was reaching its 10th and iron plateau. The descent into the burning heart of Osaka Castle was a journey into a world of falling embers, crumbling gold, and the heavy scent of scorched silk and ancient malice. The air here was no longer the crisp winter breeze of the north, but was searing, thick, and carried the suffocating weight of a dynasty's final gasp. This was the center of the world's end, where the golden power of the Amrita had been gathered into a single, desperate point to protect the young heir of the Toyotomi. The atmosphere was quiet, violent, and filled with the sound of roaring flames. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was a path of charred floorboards and molten metal, a road that felt like it was dissolving into the void with every step. The sound of the world was a low and constant rhythmic thrum of the castle's wooden bones snapping in the heat, a noise that sounded like the final heartbeat of the Sengoku era. This part of the history is a story of the mother's madness, a realization that the Lady Chodo had turned to the darkest spirits to save a world that was already gone. As William broke through the inner gates of the main keep, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and mythical terror. He was not facing men, but the nine-tailed fox, a gargantuan spirit of golden fur and blue fire that had possessed the heart of the castle. This was the era of the Fox Queen, where the atmosphere was one of blinding light and the hiss of cursed tales. You see the way the creature filled the entire courtyard, its tails moving like living pillars of flame that could sweep away entire buildings with a single flick. This part of the history is a story of the spirit of destruction, a realization that the fox had fed on the hatred and grief of the war to grow into a god of chaos. The sound of the fox's shriek was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that echoed across the burning city like a tear in the fabric of reality. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the rhythmic flow of the golden fire, feeling the steady heat of the inferno and the raw weight of the destiny that had led him to this final guardian. Deep within the subterranean chambers beneath the burning palace, the atmosphere became cramped, dark, and filled with the smell of ancient spirits. William found himself standing in a vault of infinite shadows, where the walls were lined with the caskets of the ancient lords. This was the trial of the abyssal descent, where the atmosphere was one of flickering soul light and the hiss of the serpent. The warriors found that the master of the dark, a figure hidden in the folds of the history, was using the blood of the fallen to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The sound of the spirit energy humming in the earth was a deep and final boom, making the underground chamber feel like the inside of a waiting grave. This part of the history is a realization that the true enemy was not the fox or the alchemist, but the human refusal to let go. William moved with a sturdy and measured power, his blade meeting the ethereal flesh of the shades, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the infinite dark. The battle against the Sanada Yukimura once more, now aided by the spirit of the fox, was a story of tragic honor and the final vow. The two warriors moved through the burning wreckage of the throne room like streaks of crimson and silver light, their blades meeting with a force that sent sparks of holy fire into the smoke-choked air. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and tense, with the weight of the end. This was the trial of the last samurai, where the atmosphere became one of rhythmic breathing and the sharp ring of steel. The warriors found that Yukimura fought with a burning and selfless resolve, his spear carrying the weight of his entire people. The sound of the weapons clashing was a sharp and echoing snap, making the burning chamber feel like the inside of a sacred forge. This part of the history is a realization that true peace required the death of the old legends. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his blade finally finding the closing of the era, realizing that the way of the soul was the only way to guide the brave into the light. After the guardians were put to rest, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet and mournful finality. The Lady Chodo and her son stood at the center of the flame, their eyes filled with a mix of pride and sorrow, as they realized the dream of the Toyotomi was over. This is a moment of raw and historical reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still as the gold of the castle began to turn to black ash. This part of the history is a story of the sacrifice dynasty, where the tradition of the court met the reality of the new shogunate. The sound of the wind through the burning ruins was a low and constant moan, making the world feel solid and heavy in the wake of the collapse. William stood with Hanzo, their eyes fixed on the golden embers rising into the night sky, realizing that the way of the land was now a path through the memory and the peace. Leaving the smoking ruins of Osaka behind, the journey led toward the final and infinite depths of the abyss. The atmosphere was vast, silent, and filled with a sense of timelessness, a realization that the true war for the world was fought in the spaces between. This part of the history is a story of the bloodshed's end, where the atmosphere is one of gray mists and the smell of ancient iron. You see the way the broken statues of the gods leaned into the darkness, a sign of the world's weariness. The air was cold and carried the taste of ash and the heavy scent of the spirit. The sound of the void moving over the ruins was a sharp and piercing note, signaling that the shadow of the Amrita was finally dissolving into the nothingness. William moved through the mist of the abyss, his eyes fixed on the distant flicker of the first light, realizing that, to save the future, he had to seal the gateway of the dark. Deep in the heart of the abyssal crater, the final trial of the 11th part took place, as William prepared to face the ultimate manifestation of the war. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the will of the Sengoku had taken a physical form. This is a story of the sovereignty of the fading ember, where the air was filled with the weight of the trillions of souls who had died in the long centuries of conflict. The warriors found that the ground was made of solidified grief, its surface cold as the winter sea. The sound of the wind through the abyss was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was the cycle of violence itself. William stood on the edge of the world, his blade glowing with the light of his whole journey, realizing that to finish the story, he had to become the peace he sought. The experience at Osaka and the abyss ends with William looking toward the first light of a new age rising over the ruins. The red of the fire had led to a sovereignty of the pure white dawn settling over the land. He carried the weight of the mother's silence and the honor of the last soldier. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the man was now a path into the gentle night. The focus would now shift to the final conclusion and the resting of the sword, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the sunset into a world of quiet villages, sleeping spirits, and the realization that the war for Japan was finally over. The final legacy of the 11th part of the journey is a story of the strength in the final release. You have seen the survivor break the will of the fox and find the sorrow within the palace. You have felt the sting of the fire and the weight of the dark. As the orange glow of the morning sun faded into the shadows of the ruins, and the first warm air of the peace reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its 11th and grounded resolution in the end of the Great War, leaving behind the world of the siege for a world of the silence, the memory, and a journey that was reaching its 11th and final plateau. The conclusion of the long journey through the warring states was a walk into a world of setting suns, quiet temples, and the scent of fresh grass and ancient ink. The air here was no longer filled with the choking smoke of the siege, but was warm, gentle, and carried the soft smell of the sea and the pine. This was the dawn of the Great Peace, the beginning of the Edo period, where the sovereignty of the sword was slowly giving way to the sovereignty of the pen. The atmosphere was intimate, peaceful, and filled with a sense of profound relief. The ground beneath the boots of the warrior was the solid, dry earth of a country path, and the clean wood of a simple home. The sound of the world was a low and constant rustle of the wind through the bamboo groves, and the rhythmic, distant ringing of a temple bell, a noise that sounded like the quiet breath of a land finally at rest. This part of the history is a story of the final arrival, a realization that the sailor who had come looking for a stolen spirit had found a home for his own soul. As William stood upon the cliffs, overlooking the ocean where he had first landed, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and clear reflection. He was no longer the desperate prisoner from the Tower of London, but a man who had become a living bridge between the West and the East. This was the era of the settled spirit, where the atmosphere was one of golden light and the smell of salt water. You see the way he looked out at the waves, his armor dented and scratched from 100 battles, yet his eyes were filled with a quiet and purposeful calm. This part of the history is a story of the Guardian's legacy, a realization that the Amrita had been sealed away by the will of the shogun, and the demons that once roamed the villages had retreated back into the world of myth. The sound of the waves hitting the shore was a sharp and piercing note, a noise that no longer signaled a warning, but a song of eternal return. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist and the raw weight of the peace that he had bled to protect. Deep within the gardens of the Tokugawa Palace, the atmosphere became cramped, sacred, and filled with the smell of blossoms. William found himself standing before Lord Ieyasu one last time, a man who had finally unified the fractured land. This was the trial of the final dismissal, where the atmosphere was one of soft shadows and the hiss of the tea whisk. The warriors found that the great lord sought only to ensure that the shadow of the alchemist would never return to the shores of Japan. The sound of the tea being poured was a deep and final boom, making the small room feel like the inside of a sacred mountain. This part of the history is a realization that the true victory was not in the killing of the enemy, but in the creation of a world where the sword was no longer needed. William moved with a sturdy and measured might, his head bowed in silent and absolute respect, feeling the steady pulse of the land and the constant pressure of the gratitude that the people of Japan held for the blue-eyed samurai. The final journey for Saoirse and William was a story of freedom and the light. The guardian spirit, once a stolen tool of the West, was now a free protector of the East, her form glowing with a radiant and transparent blue. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and filled with the taste of the sky. This was the trial of the last bond, where the atmosphere became one of whistling wind and the spray of the waterfall. The warriors found that the spirit was no longer bound by chains of magic, but by a choice of love. The sound of Saoirse's laughter in the wind was a sharp and echoing snap, making the forest feel like the inside of a living dream. This part of the history is a realization that true connection could never be stolen by an alchemist or broken by a war. William moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his heart finally and totally light, realizing that the way of the soul was the only way to reach the end of the world and find yourself. With the sword finally resting in its scabbard, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet and final resolution. William settled into a life of quiet vigilance, watching over the land he had come to love as a shadow guardian of the peace. This is a moment of raw and existential reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still as the history of the Nioh began to fade into the legend of the Western warrior. This part of the history is a story of the resting of the iron, where the tradition of the sailor met the reality of the permanent home. The sound of the evening crickets was a low and constant moan, making the village feel solid and heavy in the wake of the history. William stood at the door of his home, his eyes fixed on the golden moon rising over the pine, realizing that the way of the land was now a path through the simple and the everyday. leaving the frontiers of the war behind, the journey reached its final and infinite conclusion. The atmosphere was vast, silent, and filled with a sense of completion, a realization that the thousand-year storm had finally passed. This part of the history is a story of the bloodshed silence, where the atmosphere is one of purple sunsets and the smell of harvest rice. You see the way the new generations played in the streets of the capital, a sign of the world's rebirth. The air was warm and carried the taste of life and the heavy scent of the future. The sound of the world moving forward was a sharp and piercing note, signaling that the shadow of the gold was finally buried beneath the weight of the peace. William moved through the fields of the New Japan, his eyes fixed on the flicker of the first hearth fire, realizing that to save the world, he had to become a part of it. Deep in the heart of the eternal memory, the final trial of the 12th part took place as we reflect on the legacy of the fatting. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the Sengoku era had ended with the rise of the individual soul. This is a story of the sovereignty of the peaceful morning, where the air was filled with the weight of the stories told by the survivors. The warriors found that the ground was no longer made of broken spears, but of fertile soil. The sound of the wind through the history was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was only a memory of the dark. William stood at the end of the path, his journey complete and grounded, realizing that the story of the Nioh was a story of finding light in the middle of the night. The experience of the 12 parts ends with a quiet and respectful silence. The red of the war had led to a sovereignty of the pure white silence settling over the history. We carry the weight of the Williams choice and the silence of the Demon King. The atmosphere is one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the ash was now a path into the gentle night. The focus now shifts to the eternal sleep, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the ink into a world of quiet graves, living peace, and the realization that the journey was worth every step. The final legacy of the 12 parts of the journey is a story of the strength in the final piece. You have seen the survivor break the will of the alchemist and find the peace within the shogun. You have felt the sting of the salt and the weight of the gold. As the orange glow of the setting sun faded into the shadows of the mountains, and the first cool air of the evening reached the path, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of William finds its 12th and grounded resolution in the peace of the rising sun, leaving behind the world of the sword for a world of the silence, the memory, and a journey that had finally reached its ultimate and eternal conclusion.